Hello and welcome to this discussion with Dr. Hugh Ross, one of the most intelligent men of our era. He's an astrophysicist and he's a believer in Jesus Christ. And he's written this new book. It comes out October 7th and it's called Noah's Flood Revisited. And it's looking at the scientific evidences for the flood that we read about in Genesis 6 to 9. And we don't believe that this is just mythology or just fable. We believe that this actually occurred and that it was an event in man's early history. And Dr. Ross is going to talk to us about this. With me is Kelly Clemenson and Jay Ward, who are both outstanding apologists from my home church, the Packing House Church. And Kelly, would you like to start off our discussion?
Sure, I'd love to. Welcome, Dr. Ross. Great to talk with you. Got to talk to you my first time down in Corona, and just found out you're an evangelist, and I thought that was great stuff because we are as well. We share that in common. But I guess where I'd like to kind of start off, Dr. Ross, is to just tell us about your background as a scientist, but also as a Christian.
Yes, well, I was born, raised, and educated in Canada. I was not raised in a Christian home. My parents did believe in the morality that the Bible teaches, but they didn't believe in God as a creator. But I was one of these nerdy kids that got really interested in physics and astronomy. That started at age 7. I was reading 4 or 5 books on physics and astronomy during my growing up years. I knew that astrophysics would be my future career from the age of 8. And when I was 16, I did an in-depth study of cosmology. That's the science of the origin and history of the universe. And that's when I became convinced that the universe had a beginning. And if I knew the universe had a beginning, there had to be a cosmic beginner. So as at age 17, I went on a quest to find that beginner. Really didn't know where to look. I started with the writings of the great philosophers, particularly Immanuel Kant and René Descartes. Discovered they didn't have the correct concepts of space and time or the laws of physics. So that's when I began to dive into the world's holy books. Started with the Vedas, then looked at the Buddhist commentaries, the Quran, Zoroastrianism, and finally I did pick up a Bible. And I had a Bible thanks to the Gideons. The Gideons at that time were allowed to hand out Bibles in the public schools. So I began to go through that Gideon Bible and literally would spend between 1 to 2 hours a night, between midnight and 2 in the morning, studying that Bible. And over a period of 18 months, I recognized that all the science and history stated in the Bible was correct, that the Bible actually predicted hundreds of times future scientific discoveries and future historical events. And I realized this book can't come from a mere human source. It must come from the one that actually did all the creation deeds. So as at age 19, I signed my name in the back of that Gideon Bible, committing my life to Jesus Christ. And I knew that commitment implied that I needed to be public with my Christian faith and share my Christian faith with my fellow students and professors and family members. And I wound up getting a PhD in astrophysics, did 5 years of research at Caltech on quasars and galaxies. And it was there I met my first serious Christian. And he told me how to find a good church. I got involved in that church. Within a few months, they put me on the pastoral staff as their minister of evangelism with the job of training people how to use God's book of nature to bring people to the book of Scripture into a relationship with Jesus Christ. And after serving in that role for a decade, the church helped me launch Reasons to Believe, which again is an organization of scientists where we look at the latest discoveries in the book of nature and use those as a tool to bring people to Scripture and to a relationship with Jesus Christ.
That's awesome.
Yeah, that led to a question I've got. By the way, Dr. Ross, I am a Gideon. You're making me humble. All these thousands of pocket testaments I've been handing out. Thank you for that. You know, I had a question about being a scientist and the scientific method and scientific inquiry. What is your approach to these things as a Bible believer?
Well, what struck me the first time I picked up a Bible was going at the first page, Genesis 1, and recognizing that it perfectly followed the scientific method. It took me another 9 years to figure out why it so carefully followed the scientific method. The history of the scientific method is that people during the Reformation were reading the Bible for themselves, and those with a scientific bent recognized this biblical testing method, applied it to their research, and that explains why the scientific revolution exploded out of Reformation Europe. So that was my first clue. This book is different from all the other books I've read, and that, hey, the Bible actually exhorts me to put everything to the test, shows me how to put things to the test. And over an 18-month period, that testing brought me into a relationship with Jesus Christ.
That's great. Hey, a question we wanted to ask right off the bat, Dr. Ross, but I think we got off a little bit. But based on what the fact you just said, how did you deal with in the New Testament talking about Jesus rising from the dead after he was brutally murdered? How did your, because I know how it came to me. I just thought, okay, well, he seems to be able to do such things, but how did that come down the road for you?
Well, what struck me is reading Corinthians, where Paul makes the point that if Jesus did not rise bodily from the dead, Christians are to be pitied amongst all people because they have believed a lie. But if the evidence actually stands up that he did rise bodily from the dead, that means there's a God that's got the power to raise anybody he chooses bodily from the dead. So I spent quite a bit of time during my late teenage years looking at the historical case for the bodily resurrection of Jesus from the dead. In fact, I read something from the 19th century where three European lawyers who were atheists decided to put the resurrection of Jesus on trial. They kind of did a mock trial and wound up concluding that the historical evidence for Jesus rising from the dead was stronger than the historical evidence that Napoleon was defeated at Waterloo. And these three lawyers were all alive at the time that Napoleon was defeated at Waterloo. So I said, hey, if the evidence is that strong, this is something I can really hang my hat on. And so that was part of my conversion experience.
Right, that's awesome. Daniel, would you like to chime in?
Well, let's have
Or
a
go
talk
ahead,
about
Jay.
his book. You know, I have read your book, Noah's Flood Revisited. I got the advanced copy, and I was keenly interested in the things that you talked about that prompted you to write it. And I'd love for you to share that because I think that's super important for apologists to know.
Well, what I've been noticing in the 21st century are theologians, including very conservative Bible-believing theologians, saying we have to abandon this idea that the account of Noah's flood in Genesis is literal and historically correct. We need to see it as an allegory of how God intends to redeem us. It can't be a literally true story. And the reason why is they claim science forces us into that interpretation. But as I read these books written by leading theologians, it's like they didn't have the scientific goods to really back up their claim. And so it was actually a group of theologians who believed in a literal historical account of Genesis flood that said, Hugh, you're a scientist, you've dived into the theology, you need to write this book. And so with their exhortation, I wrote the book. And it's a book I've been meaning to write for more than a decade, but I waited until we had solid, indisputable scientific evidence for the events of Genesis 9, 10, and 11. And if we can get a solid case for that scientifically, that allows us to draw implications for the events of 6, 7, and 8. And so a lot of the book focuses on what you see in Genesis 10 and 11 is that God is upset that after the flood, humanity was refusing to multiply and fill the earth. They're remaining in one place. They're rebelling against God's command. And so he says he forcibly scatters humanity over the face of the earth. And now, in the last 3 years, we got very strong scientific evidence that Northern Europe, Southern Europe, Western Africa, Australia, New Guinea, Tasmania, Eastern Asia, including Japan and Borneo and Indonesian islands. They were all settled and colonized at the same time. And by 4 independent dating methods, we can nail that down. So that would imply that Noah's flood must predate that time. And the date we come up with for Noah's flood basically solves all the scientific objections that people had to taking it literally and historically. So I got to speak to it at the conference in July at the American Scientific Affiliation, which was loaded with scientists and theologians. Their comment was, "This solves all the problems. We really can believe that the account in Genesis is literal and historical."
Now, you've taken the position that it is a worldwide flood or was a worldwide flood versus a global flood. And
Yes.
I understand in reading the book that it's both textual and scientific, both. And we were wondering if you could kind of elaborate on that so our listeners can get a better idea of what the main point of the book is in those regards.
Well, I basically respond to people claiming that if you read the Genesis text literally, the flood is either globally extensive or it only impacts a small segment of humanity, local. And I said there's a third possibility. It's a worldwide flood where the entire world of ungodly people is wiped out and all the animals associated with those ungodly people. But if you don't have human beings living in Antarctica, there's no need for God to flood Antarctica, nor is there any need for Noah to take a pair of emperor penguins on board the ark. And so I have a chapter in the book where I say a bigger issue doctrinally is the doctrine of God's judgment. So basically go through the entire Bible and look at every instance where God brings judgment on reprobate human sin. And in every single case, it's akin to what a surgeon will tell you when he says, "Hey, we've done a biopsy on you. You've got a stage 4 tumor. I want to remove that tumor. I'm going to kill that tumor, get it out of your body, but his goal is to save the healthy tissue." Likewise, every time God judges, he removes the malignant evil, but he saves the healthy tissue. Probably one of the best examples of that is where Abraham has a dialogue with God about Sodom and Gomorrah. And basically, what we understand is Sodom and Gomorrah had become so reprobate that the entire human habitation of those cities had to be removed, along with all of their animals and all their material goods. But at one point, Abraham says, "God, what about these wicked Amorites up in the hills with me?" The response God gives to Abraham, "Their wickedness has not yet reached its fullness. I will not touch them. But 400 years from now, it will reach its fullness, and your descendants will take them out." So that tells us that God always limits the expression of his judgment wrath to the extent of human reprobation. So if there's no reprobation in Greenland or Antarctica, there's no need for God to flood Greenland and Antarctica. As it says in 2 Peter 2:5, the entire world of ungodly people was flooded. But at that time, we didn't have a globally extensive human population like we do today.
So you're saying then that the science backs up the dispersal of humanity
Right.
after the Tower of Babel, and so
Yes,
that
backs it up in
humanity.
spades. I mean, for example, we have 4 different dating methods, human remains that can be well dated. The artifacts associated with those humans can be dated. One of the things about our humans compared to, say, all the other bipedal primates, because of our jaw structure and our jaw muscles, we're forced to eat soft food to get the calories we need. And what you notice is the earliest humans were gathering grains, roasting the grains, grinding them, roasting and boiling them so that they could eat them. And so new scientific evidence is when were humans first preparing their food so they can get a lot of calories in a hurry. And we now have dates that are consistent with the genetic dates, with the human remains dates, with the artifacts with the dates, and basically demonstrating there's this very aggressive migration from the near Middle East into all the parts of Africa, Asia, Europe, and Australia. And because the ice age is happening during the last ice age, there are easy migration routes to facilitate this. In fact, the genetics tells us the exact routes that humans took to migrate and colonize all those parts of the world. So
And Dr. Ross, one
that's
of
the
your
brand new science.
Right, that's fascinating. It's God's timing, right?
Right.
and Dr. Ross, your book lists many historical accounts of a great flood outside of the Bible, and so we're talking about Native American cultures, African cultures, Asian cultures, Celtic cultures, that they all knew that there was some type of a watery catastrophe in humanity's past. And tell us a little bit about that and how that's one of the great proofs that exists that the story that we have in the Bible has a true historical basis.
Well, almost every ancient culture has got a creation story or a creation legend that's somewhat akin to what you see in Genesis. But as many creation legends exist in the ancient world, there's way more flood legends. I mean, we're talking 300 in North and South America alone. And what's interesting is that they're not talking about a partial flood where only a segment of humanity is wiped out. Um, One of the factors they share in common is this is something that's ubiquitous to all of humanity. So the similarities in all these flood accounts all over the world, 300 in North and South America, 300 in Africa, Europe, and Asia, the similarities basically argue there must have been a major flood event in ancient human history to explain just how all these stories exist and how the differences in the stories, you get a greater departure from what you see in Genesis. The farther you get from the Middle East area and the farther back in time you go. And, this is like the game of telephone. You'd
Mhm.
expect that you would get that kind of
A little
distortion.
bit of legend to develop.
Right, right.
Yeah. So, Dr. Ross, what's your time frame on the flood? I mean, if you can narrow it down to a certain
Well,
average
what's
time frame.
brand new in the book is we're able to nail down the date for the events of Genesis 10 and 11, basically demonstrating that North Europe is colonized the same time as Southern Europe, which is quite surprising. You'd expect
Mhm.
Southern Europe to be colonized first, then
Yeah,
Northern Europe,
forward.
but it's simultaneous. And it's
Mhm.
simultaneous with Eastern Asia, simultaneous with Tasmania, Australia, and New Guinea. And because this happened during the last ice age, you got land bridges that facilitate this. So Great Britain was attached to France by a land bridge. Japan was attached. Borneo was attached. And it was relatively easy to get to Australia. But the dates come in between 40 to 50,000 years ago for all
Mhm.
of those colonization events.
Okay.
So, and you say, can't you come up with a more accurate date? Well, we're using carbon 14, which is an assumption-free dating method. But when you're getting down around 40 to 50,000 years ago, the error bar becomes plus or minus several
Hmm.
thousand years. So that's the best we can do, but it implies that Noah's flood must predate that. And what I find interesting is that during the last ice age, from 50,000 years ago to 120,000 years ago, you've got six major melt events, which explains how the flood could last for a whole year. I mean, the Bible tells us where the flood waters come from, but it doesn't tell us how they're sustained.
Right.
And the point there is 40 days and 40 nights of torrential rain and God uplifting water from the underground aquifers, that gives you more than enough water to wipe out all of humanity, all their building structures. take care of all the animals they had domesticated. But that water is going to flow relatively quickly out into the oceans. There
Mhm.
has to be a supply of water to replace the water flowing out. But if you got thousands of feet of thick ice melting quickly, like what happened during the last ice age, the water that flows out into the ocean would be replaced by the melting snow and ice from these major melt events.
Right.
So,
So
Um,
are you saying then that the genetics now too, that our knowledge of the genome, the human genome, and how that has mutated or whatever, that corroborates what the archaeology is telling us?
while it does for the Great Migrations, it's less accurate when you're trying to nail down the genetic date for Adam and Eve or a genetic date for Noah and his family. The more recent the genetic analysis, the more likely it is to have a small error bar. And what I found interesting is that these genetic methods, they're based on mathematical assumptions. Uh, those mathematical assumptions are more reliable the more closer you get to the present. But the genetic dates agree with the three carbon-14 dates for human remains, the relics, and the evidence we have that early humans were cooking their food. And so the fact that all four dating methods agree with one another, I think gives us a strong case. This is a reliable date for the events of Genesis 10 and 11. The genealogy in Genesis 11 would say there's got to be a few thousand years between the colonization event and the flood. How many thousands? We don't know. Uh, Given that it has to be around one of these major melt events, that gives us a range of dates between about 150,000 years ago and 55,000 years ago. Now, that's still quite a range of dates. Uh, if I'm fairly confident that something between 60 to 90,000 years ago is defensible. I don't think we're ever going to come up with a date more accurate than that. But to be conservative, I would say 55 to 115.
so, Dr. Ross, one other thing that I've heard recently about the water levels. 10 or 12 years ago, I was on a debate with atheists, and their main point was the fact that there wasn't enough water on the earth to be able to cover the earth, even with lower mountain levels. But
Right.
from what I gather, recently they found that a reservoir that had actually what 3 times more water below than they have above.
Well, if you're talking the mantle, there's more water in the mantle than there is on the surface of the earth. The problem is getting that water to the surface of the earth without killing all life on the face of the earth.
Mm-hmm.
So I argue in the book that that's not going to save the global flood model. I mean, the skeptics are right. There's not enough water in the face of the earth to cover all the land masses on the face of the earth. People who hold to a global flood have appealed to the water that's in the mantle. But if you bring that water up quickly, it has catastrophic effects. I mean, the Bible tells us the ark actually survived. The people on board the ark survived. And to bring that much water up from the mantle, you would need extremely aggressive tectonic activity. And that tectonic activity would release energy, and the energy is enough to turn all the water in the face of the earth into steam. And the biblical text is clear that didn't happen. And one thing I quote from a number of global flood proponents in the book to make the point that they all recognize that to make a global flood model work, they need the laws of physics during the time of Noah's flood to be changed by a factor of 1 billion times. And they acknowledge that's a big problem. Well, it's a big problem for two reasons. If you accelerate the radiometric decay rates by a factor of 1 billion times, you kill all life on the face of the earth. I mean, for example, there's potassium 40 in your body. Yeah, and that potassium 40 is decaying. You accelerate that decay rate by a factor of 1 billion times, your body will instantly vaporize. So, and also you got the problem, 7 places in the Bible it tells us that the laws of physics are immutable. They don't change. And as an astronomer, I can tell you, when we look at the spectra of stars and galaxies, those spectra tell us there's been no change in the laws of physics in the past history of the universe. So on that basis alone, I would argue the global flood model is ruled out. I would also argue it's ruled out by Psalm 104, because Psalm 104 takes you through the 6 days of creation that you see in Genesis chapter 1. And when Psalm 104 addresses creation day 3, where God transforms the earth from a water world to where you have oceans and continents coexisting, that's verses 6, 7, and 8. Verse 9 tells us, once the continents are in place, never again will water cover the whole face of the earth. So that's one of several biblical texts that rule out a global flood. That's my position. The Bible teaches a worldwide flood. It does not teach a global flood.
Mm-hmm. On that particular one on Psalm 104, at the end you reference that it never again will be at that. Does that any way say that it did happen at one time?
Well,
So
it's
said
referring
again.
to the fact that
Yeah.
in Genesis 1,
Uh-huh.
excuse me, first starts off as a water world. I
Mm-hmm.
mean, what you see in Genesis 1, 2, there's water over the whole face of the earth,
Yes.
and there's darkness over the whole face of the earth. God transforms the clouds so the light can come through. But on creation day 3, he transforms the earth so that now you have land masses and oceans coexisting.
Yes.
But what you see
Mm-hmm.
in Psalm 104 is that once you get the continents forming, those continents remain as a permanent barrier, preventing Earth from becoming a water world like it was in the beginning. Never again will that happen.
Well, speaking of water, I was fascinated by your analysis of how the extent of the water in the flood as you've analyzed that, and what Noah could see from the top of the boat and where the boat landed. And so I think it would be informative for our listeners to kind of get a better, clearer picture of how you see the scope of the flood and how that would have impacted what Noah saw and what Noah did and whatnot.
Yeah, very good.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, the text that global flood people go to is Genesis 7:19, where it talks about how God brought this rainfall, the underground aquifers, and water covered the whole face of the earth. Well, you see a similar phrase in Genesis 8:9. Okay, Genesis 8, the floodwaters are receding. Genesis 8:5, Noah on top of the ark can now see the distant hills because of the receding of the waters. Genesis 8:9, he releases a dove, and the dove is flying over the waters, and it says in the context of the dove that the dove returned to Noah because there was water over the whole face of the earth. It's the same phrase you see in Genesis 7:19, which tells me we should interpret Genesis 7:19 that at the height of the flood, Noah on top of the ark could only see water from one horizon to the other. So all the hills and mountains he was familiar with were covered with water. And that's what was happening with the dove. The dove, because it was flying lower over the water than Noah was on top of the ark, could only see water from one horizon to the other. Noah, being 30 or 40 feet higher, could actually see the distant hills. And so what I put in the book is, hey, even if you're only 10 feet higher than someone else, you can see a lot farther over the horizon. And that's the crow's nest effect. On sailing days, they would put a sailor up in the crow's nest because that sailor, being 40 feet higher above the deck of the ship, could see land masses, easily 100 miles farther away than people that were on the deck of the ship.
Dr. Ross, you also mentioned about Noah's Ark too, of the question of is Noah's Ark still around? There's actually been expeditions that have been done for it. And you highlight that it landed on the mountains of Ararat, not necessarily Mount Ararat itself.
Right.
So could you tell us a little bit of your views of what happened to the Ark and where you think it actually landed?
Well, I think it's significant that God told Noah build the ark out of gopher wood. And people have speculated, what is this gopher wood? Well, what I find interesting, if you go through the Old Testament, it mentions 5 different kinds of softwood species and 21 different kinds of hardwood species. And so in terms of what is this gopher wood, well, it's not one of the 21 hardwoods that are mentioned elsewhere in the Old Testament. It has to be a hardwood that's even stronger than the 21 that are mentioned. And one of those 21 is acacia wood, which is a wood that's almost twice the strength of oak. And God is saying, hey, I want you to build a big ark, 450 feet long. And people will tell you, hey, if it's 450 feet long, you're not building it out of oak. Oak is not strong enough for a boat that big. But God said, hey, build it out of gopher wood. Well, this would have been a wood with a strength index greater than acacia. Now, I argue that that kind of wood would have had such a high value for construction projects. There's no way the post-flood peoples left that wood lying around. They would have gone to the ark and they would have raided that wood because of how valuable that wood was for their building projects. And as you pointed out, the text says the ark came to rest on the mountains of Ararat. Doesn't say Mount Ararat, says the mountains of Ararat. And the Hebrew word for mountain also includes hills. And I discussed this with an Armenian scholar. They told me that the name of their ancient nation of Armenia was the mountains of Ararat. It's almost 100,000 square miles. So it's a huge area, and it extends all the way down to just a few miles north of the ancient city of Nineveh. So I'm saying, hey, if that's where the ark came to rest, and that's a likely resting place, because during the last ice age, you had major cyclones in the Indian Ocean. That would have created a wind that would have driven the ark up against those foothills of Ararat. But it's so close to the ancient city of Nineveh that I think if you want to find the remains of Noah's Ark, it'll be in the ashes of Nineveh. That the wood would have been raided, and then Nineveh was burnt to the ground several times. The best you're going to find are the ashes.
And Dr. Ross, you mentioned the dimensions of the ark, 450 feet, and that's one area where a lot of people who think that the story of Noah is fable or myth, they picture a much smaller ark. But when you read about it, this is a massive ocean-going vessel. And so the idea of this being just like a little children's story, it's very much challenged when you think of how big the ark really was.
Well, skeptics claim it's impossible to build a boat that big out of wood. And they've got a point if you're talking oak. Oak is not strong enough to build a boat that big. But also, the biggest boats that were built, well, in fact, there was a boat built out of oak, the Wyoming, that was almost as big as Noah's Ark. But it wasn't very seaworthy. They had to keep patching it up during the ocean voyages. But the thing about Noah's Ark, it didn't have to have sails. It didn't need oars. It didn't need a rudder. It's basically a barge. And so you don't need a barge to be as strong as a clipper sailing ship. A clipper sailing ship is going to be stressed by the masts and the sails. So it's much harder to make a boat seaworthy if it's a sailing clipper ship. A barge, not so much. I'd also say if it's made out of gopher wood, there's no problem. It would have been plenty strong enough to be a boat that big. I also argue that Noah was commissioned to save all the soulish animals that were in relationship with humanity. That's a lot of animals. I argue you're probably looking at 300 pairs of animals. And so you're going to need a big ship in order to be able to house that many animals, plus all the food that they need for a whole year's voyage. So to claim that the ark is smaller, well, you got a problem. How could Noah rescue all those animals if the boat is smaller? And people say, well, maybe they all hibernated and didn't eat. Well, I think they were eating. And I think Noah's family was taking care of him. They needed a big boat. Moreover, Noah was commissioned to relaunch civilization. So I think he had tools on board the ark, and had the supplies and ropes he needed in order to relaunch civilization after the flood is over. So, but yeah, the size of the ark is a subject that skeptics like to pick apart.
You know, you make a textual argument for a more, I'll call it regional flood than a global flood.
Yes.
And this is where people are getting hung up. One of the reasons, right? Because they keep seeing the word earth, all flesh on the earth, this whole thing in English that would point us. And I know you went back to the Hebrew, et cetera. Could you just briefly explain how somebody that would come back, for example, after this interview, and would read this for themselves, and they're going to see these words? How did you approach that? How should somebody else approach that? And
Well, I don't tell the story in the book, but about a decade ago, over a long weekend, I debated three theologians who hold to a global flood interpretation. And they basically made that point. Notice more than 20 times it's using the words all and every. This has to include everything. And my response was, well, it's saying that all of humanity was impacted by this flood. That's my model. I don't believe in a local flood where only part of humanity was impacted. I believe in a flood big enough that all of humanity was impacted. So the all and every is in there. They also made the argument that when you look at Genesis 7 and 8, it's using the words for earth, eres and Adama. And those are words that can be used for part of the earth, but they can mean the whole of the earth. And they also made the point there are three Hebrew words that never can mean the whole of the earth. They can only mean part of the earth. And they asserted that none of those words are ever used in Genesis 6, 7, and 8. I checked up on them. They're incorrect. The word karabah, which could never be used for all the land masses on the face of the earth, shows up in Genesis 8. So their assertion turned out to be incorrect. There actually is a word in the text that tells us it's not all the land masses, it's simply the land masses that were occupied by human beings. Now, we're still talking a really big flood because I argue at that time you got humanity filling virtually all of the Near and Middle East and perhaps even parts of Eastern Africa. So it's not your typical local flood model that only floods Mesopotamia. It's a much bigger flood than that. And if we're talking during the last ice age, you can get floods that big quite easily.
so people coming back to look at this now, when they're looking at these words, you recommend they go to like a Hebrew concordance, like Strong's or something like that, and look at the definitions. I looked at that for myself. I heard you and I looked and I did see that a word erat, and it could mean territory or it
Yeah.
could mean earth. So are you basically suggesting that if people still have questions about this, that they should actually go back to these Hebrew definitions?
Yes, and what I've done in the book is actually give you the lexical definitions for the terms. I mean, another big debate is, what animals were wiped out by the flood? What animals did Noah take on board the ark? And I make the point that if you go carefully through Genesis 7 and 8, you get seven distinct Hebrew words for the animals that were designated for destruction. And if you synthesize those seven Hebrew words, it tells us it's the soulish animals that are in relationship with humans. And this gives you consistency with the doctrine of God's judgment. What you see in the book of Leviticus is that animals that are violent towards other animals and towards humans, the owners of those animals are to be rebuked. And if the animals continue in that behavior, the animals are to be killed, and the owner of those animals is to be killed along with the animals. Basically, making the argument the reason why those animals behave that way, God designed the soulish animals, the basically birds and mammals. He designed them to be tamed by humans and to serve and please human beings. And if what brings pleasure to the human owner is that animal viciously attacking other animals and people, that's how the animal will behave, which is why God says not just the humans, but the animals associated with reprobate humans must be destroyed because they're beyond repair. Because of their bonded relationship with these wicked human beings, they're behaving in a way that's dangerous towards other animals and other people. However, you can sin as much as you want in front of the cockroaches in your home. It's not going to change the behavior of the cockroaches. Doing that in front of your dog, because that dog is so strongly motivated to please you, how you behave in front of your dog is going to affect the behavior of the dog. But notice the book of Leviticus always holds the human owners responsible for the behavior of their pets and their domesticated animals.
Dr. Ross, I'd like to make a turn here for just a minute. Before we got a chance to talk with you, I was looking at the anthropic principle, the strong and weak one.
Yes.
What I observed from it, it seems like that the weak anthropic principle would you say that that's kind of an excuse that is being played?
Well, the weak anthropic principle is
Mhm.
astronomers and physicists looking at the universe and saying it's extremely fine-tuned, exquisitely fine-tuned to make life possible, and even more exquisitely fine-tuned to make human beings possible. The strong anthropic principle basically says for the universe to exist, it must have these features. So notice the first definition is an observation, and that observation's got theological implications. Hey, if it's fine-tuned to that degree, who is the fine-tuner?
Right.
The strong anthropic principle is basically trying to say God's got nothing to do with it. This is something that's fundamental in the physics of the universe. It must have these characteristics for the physics to work. But nobody's ever provided any physical evidence for the strong anthropic principle.
When I read that, I was stating it kind of differently, and maybe they got it confused, but it seemed like the weak anthropic principle was the one that was saying that um, the universe is the way it is because it needs to be, because that's how we observe it to be.
That's the strong anthropic principle.
So they got those reversed.
Yeah, the
when
weak
I was reading it.
anthropic principle is simply astronomers noting, hey, it's fine-tuned and it's fine-tuned to such a remarkable degree. There must be some reason why it's so fine-tuned. And what I find interesting is that the level of fine-tuning is trillions and trillions and trillions of times greater than anything we human beings are capable of. And we've done some amazing designs, but the one that designed the universe is way beyond us. So it tells us the cosmic designer must be a being that's trillions and trillions of times more intelligent, more knowledgeable, more creative, and more powerful than we human beings.
Mhm.
Which is why I argue the weak anthropic principle not only establishes the existence of God, it tells us that God must be a personal being, because only a personal being can manifest the attributes of intelligence, knowledge, creativity, and power. So this really does nail down the God of the Bible as opposed to the gods of the Eastern religions of the world.
Right. And I believe, if I'm not mistaken, Dr. Fred Hoyle, wasn't
Yes.
that his main reason for abandoning the atheistic or materialistic worldview?
Well, he's an
Like
interesting character.
superintelligence.
I had him as a professor at both, when I was at Caltech, and I read his books. In fact, I read one of his books when I was 7 years of age, and he was definitely not a Christian. In fact, when I was reading his book at age 7, he was an atheist.
Mhm.
But then he began to study how the elements in the universe were formed, how the universe only begins with hydrogen, and then some of the hydrogen gets fused into helium, and the physics of stars produces all the other elements. It was Fred Hoyle who discovered there's incredible fine tuning in how you get the elements of the periodic table. And he concluded by saying somebody must have monkeyed with the physics and
Yeah.
chemistry and the biology to make all this work.
Yeah. I love that statement when he
Right.
came up with that. Is that something that you use for the people that you hang
Well,
with,
that's
so to
what
speak?
transformed Fred Hoyle from an atheist to being a deist.
Theist, yeah.
but I don't think he ever became a theist or a
Yeah, I
Christian.
never read anything about him
Yeah.
quoting Christ or anything
He
like
seemed to
that.
be quite opposed to the Christian faith.
Yeah, that's what I think that was one. Einstein, wasn't he? Wasn't he kind of opposed to that as well? A personal God?
Yes, I think Einstein was a little more open than Fred Hoyle was, and recognizing, hey, there's somebody that's tinkering with everything. So, and
Okay. Is
interesting
that
thing about Einstein, people ask him, well, why aren't you, a Christian or a believer in Judaism? And he said the problem of evil is what's holding him up. And,
oh,
and it's like, but there's
interesting.
good answers, but nobody
Yeah.
gave a good answer.
Right.
Is
Well,
that
that's what we want to do. We want to give good answers.
yes.
Right.
I think what Kelly's driving at is that as a scientist, when you are sharing your faith, how does that work as a scientist? Is there specific approaches that you think about or you might recommend to others?
Well, I mean, I founded Reasons to Believe 40 years ago, and in that ministry, we've developed literally dozens of different scientific tools you can use to bring people to faith in Christ. And people always ask me, well, which tool can I use in everybody? And I said, there's no such thing as a silver bullet. Every human is different from every other human. When you approach an unbeliever, you need to ask them questions. Find out what their issues are. What are their barriers? Then select from one of the 100 or so scientific evidences for the Christian faith and the inerrancy of the Bible and use that one. But there's no such thing as one evidence works for all people, which is why it's important. Ask good questions, find out who you're dealing with, what their issues are, and you want to build some level of trust with that non-Christian. I mean, if you're willing to listen to them and respond to their primary objections, you can get them on the pathway to becoming a follower of Jesus Christ.
Dr. Ross, looking a little bit at Noah's flood and how it's used in the Bible, because I recall from a lot of your textbooks were used as my homeschool materials. You always emphasize that we need to take the Bible not just literally, but also literally and consistently. And Noah's flood is not limited to Genesis 6 to 9. It's
Right.
also found in the Psalms. It's also used by Jesus himself, and it's used by the apostles, most notably Peter. And I'd be interested in hearing your thoughts of how do you bring the Noah's flood story together into the broader biblical meta narrative, or like which means
Now,
the,
that's an
the
excellent
overall
point.
look at what the Bible is really all about.
And especially when you're dealing with people outside the church, people who really haven't read the Bible, they have this perception that everything the Bible says about Noah's flood is in Genesis 6 through 9. And so what I do early in the book is say, no, there's a lot of content on Noah's flood outside the book of Genesis. And we need to integrate, as you point out, take it all literally and consistently. I'll give you an example. Nowhere in Genesis does it talk about Noah's ministry while he was building the flood, but it is addressed in 2 Peter and the book of Hebrews, basically saying that as Noah was building the ark, God had him be a prophet to the wicked people surrounding them, and how he preached literally for decades while the ark was being constructed by him and his sons and the workers that they had hired. And this is something you see throughout the entire Bible. Whenever God intends to bring judgment upon reprobate human beings, he always sends a prophet first. And so, for example, people have argued, hey, why didn't God just have Noah move away, take the animals with him, move outside the area of human habitation, let God wipe out all those reprobate people, and then return? Well, God wanted him to preach to his generation. And so it wasn't an option for him to move away. He was there to preach to his generation. So just like God had raised up Lot to be a judge in the city gate of Sodom, God raised up Noah to be a prophet to his generation. And I think that was something, building a wooden boat 450 feet long in a place where it never rains, that would have gotten attention. I think people all over the inhabited world would come to see this thing that Noah was building, to ridicule him. That's something else you see in the New Testament, that Noah, while he was building the ark, was being ridiculed by the wicked people around him.
Mhm.
So you actually get a better context for what's happening if you integrate all these texts. Likewise, if you go into Psalms and Job and Proverbs, they all address the flood issue. That's where you understand, hey, this is a time when humanity had not yet filled the earth. They were living in one region, and the flood wiped out all of humanity by inundating a single large region. So by integrating all these biblical texts, you resolve a lot of the misconceptions that atheists and skeptics have about the flood.
And Jesus uses Noah's flood as an
Right.
example of his second coming. And would you like to share a little bit about that?
Well, what I've put in the early chapters of the book is a history of what Christian scholars thought about Noah's flood. Now, what's interesting is they all claimed that the flood was worldwide. But the earliest Christian scholar that claims explicitly that it's global is late 17th century England and the Netherlands. Those are the first two nations of the world that became global in their perspective. And not until they became global in their perspective do you see anyone interpreting the flood text as being a global event. But what you also see in those first 17 centuries of commentary, they all believed that the account of Noah's flood was allegorical to how God intends to redeem humanity from their sin and evil. They also claimed it was allegorical for water baptism and spirit baptism. So Jesus basically was referring to Noah and the flood as an analogy for how he was going to bring about the salvation of people who want to put their trust in him. So, yeah, the main story of the flood is God rescuing humanity from self-extermination. And so people kind of look at the flood as, God just pouring out his wrath upon humanity. He was actually rescuing humanity. The murder rate was so out of control, humanity was in grave danger of exterminating themselves to death. God stepped in and stopped that from happening. So I look at the flood as an object lesson of God's mercy and redemption, not the one of a wrathful God wiping out humanity.
The first mention of grace in the Bible is with Noah as well, where it says Noah
Right.
found grace in the eyes of the Lord.
That's right. So, yeah, that positive spin on Noah's flood, I think, is well supported by the New Testament.
Just it seems to be like the one that's making the left or right turns, Dr. Ross. But could you speak a little bit about an apologetics atmosphere? It's hard to skip over the idea of evolution and maybe theistic evolution. Can you talk a little bit about that, where you may have been at one point as to where you are now, and how that idea
Well, I
where
wasn't raised in a Christian home, really didn't
Mhm,
get to meet a serious Christian until I got my PhD. Uh, but I can tell you this, I was never an evolutionist.
mhm,
Even as a young child, I realized, okay, stars get brighter and brighter as they get older and older. And yes, there is this history of life on planet Earth. But what's interesting, as the sun gets brighter and brighter, when you look at the fossil record, you see these mass extinction events where millions of species are quickly driven to extinction, but every mass extinction event is followed by a mass speciation event where millions of new species appear. But what I found interesting, even growing up, the new species are more efficient at pulling greenhouse gases out of the atmosphere than the species that were driven to extinction. And so this explains how life remained on planet Earth, because life can only tolerate about a 1% change in the brightness of the sun. And the sun today is 23% brighter than it was at the time of the first life on planet Earth. And so what you see in Psalm 104, it's a property of all life to die off, but God recreates and renews the face of the earth. And so even as a teenager, I recognize how life remains on earth. There's this God that removes life from planet Earth, replaces it with new life, that more efficiently removes greenhouse gases from the atmosphere. So as the sun is getting brighter and brighter, Earth's atmosphere is becoming progressively weaker and weaker in its capacity to trap heat from the sun, keeping the temperature on the surface of the Earth optimal for life throughout the whole history of life. But here's the bottom line. Only a mind that knows the future physics of the sun would know which life to remove and which new life to create to replace that life that's been removed.
Mhm.
Mindless evolution will have no idea how to make that work. If there is no God, we would expect Earth to quickly become permanently sterile. The fact that it has remained abundant with life and diverse life tells us this mind was intervening in supernatural ways. And that's the theme you see in Psalm 104. If you look at the entire creation psalm, it's about God packing the earth with as much life as possible, as diverse as possible, and as long as possible. Evolution can't pull that off, but God can.
I can.
This raises a question I had just in general, where as a scientist, you're examining the natural and yet you recognize the supernatural. And where do you make the leap in your own mind from what's natural versus supernatural without getting into one of these God of the gaps scenarios?
Well, I contrast the God of the gaps with the no God of the gaps. Basically
Yeah,
claiming if you're
exactly.
saying there's no God, do you get more gaps than those of us who believe in God? And the answer is yes, they get a lot more gaps.
Yeah.
And the more we learn about the record of nature, the bigger and more numerous the no God of the gaps become. So it's important to contrast those two models. But what persuaded me early in my life is we have these space-time theorems, which basically prove not only does the universe have a beginning, space and time have a beginning. And so when I run into scientists who say, hey, I don't believe in miracles, I'm saying, well, based on the space-time theorems, we got this miracle of space-time, matter, and energy coming into existence from something beyond space-time, matter, and energy. That's the biggest miracle any scientist could possibly hope to uncover. And if that's established fact, why are you quibbling these more minor miracles? So if you got God performing a miracle as big as bringing the whole universe into existence, that opens the door for other miracles. Basically making the point, you need a scientific model where you allow for both and make the measurements and the experiments and observations and see how many miracles are sustained and how many natural, because that's what the Bible teaches. It's a combination of natural process and supernatural intervention. And that's where I think scientists can have a lot of fun.
Do you find that the those that are kind of dedicated to evolutionary process, is that dwindling? Is it coming to the forefront that the findings over the last 50 or 60 years has made it even more improbable that that could have happened?
Yeah, as long as you're careful with the definitions, because often you'll
Yeah,
run into these scientists who say, hey, evolution is proven beyond any shadow of doubt. Well, they're right.
part of it is. Yeah.
Yeah, part of it is. We can prove beyond any reasonable shadow of doubt things have changed over the history of the earth. Life has changed over the history of the earth. So we're not quibbling the changes, we're quibbling what's responsible for those changes.
Hmm.
But where I am seeing a big impact on the secular scientific community is the recognition that there are events in the fossil record where we see a sudden appearance of phyla. A phylum refers to a basic body plan.
Hmm.
So, for example, all birds and mammals and humans are part of the chordate phylum. That describes animals with a body plan where they have a long neural cord. It includes all the vertebrates and a lot of invertebrates. Well, at the Cambrian explosion, we see this sudden appearance of 30 plus phyla, and they all show up simultaneously. And atheists, paleontologists like James Valentine and his colleagues have commented on this. We look at the Cambrian Avalon explosions, the phyla show up first, and then we get the classes. then we get the orders, then we get the families and the genera. Last of all, we get the diversification of species. The problem for the naturalists is our naturalistic evolutionary models tell us mutations, gene exchange, natural selection, epigenetics will produce a proliferation of species. And if you wait long enough, you get the genera. If you wait even longer, you get the families, then the orders, the classes, last of all, the phyla. But it was James Valentine and his colleague who wrote a paper in the scientific journals basically saying what we see is the opposite. Our naturalistic models say species diversification first, phyla diversification last. The fossil record tells us it's the exact opposite. You get the diversification of phyla first and the diversification of species at the very end. But that's exactly what you'd expect from a creator that's intent on packing the earth with as much life as possible and as diverse as possible. Of course, he's going to create the phyla first.
And Dr. Ross, probably no event in the Bible is as ridiculed in the educational sector as Noah's flood, and you mentioned that in the first chapter of your book. You talk
Right.
about that. What would you say with the research that you've done and with the findings that you've put together here? What would you say to those in leadership in the educational sector of why they should rethink putting down Noah's flood and quickly making it sound like a fable that is like fantastic and couldn't possibly be true, and integrating that into textbooks and curriculum and all that? What would you say to them of why they should give Noah's flood a second look and give them pause in looking at it that way?
That was my motivation for writing the book. No other passage of the Bible gets as much ridicule and scorn as the account of the flood of Noah. Basically, you got skeptics saying, this is so absurd, it's not worth reading anything in the Bible. This is total nonsense. Well, it's total nonsense if you think the flood happened, say, 5,000 or 6,000 years ago, and if you think it impacted the entire globe and is responsible for all the geological features. That's kind of what skeptics think the Bible teaches. And so, what my motivation for writing this book is basically trying to transform this text that receives the greatest ridicule and mockery and making it one of the strongest passages in the Bible, that this book indeed is the inspired, inerrant word of the God that created everything. That's been my motivation as evangelist. Take the most challenged parts of Scripture that people view as the weakest case for the Christian faith, transform them into the strongest case for the Christian faith, and now you got a tool to bring a lot of people to faith in Christ.
Mhm.
Now, what I tell pastors is often they look at this and say, you know what, I'm just going to avoid addressing that issue. And when a non-Christian brings it up, I'm going to change the subject and talk about the resurrection. Right away, you lose credibility with non-Christians when they can see that you're avoiding the hard questions. If you're willing to take on the hard questions and make them a strong argument for the Christian faith, you're going to bring a lot more people to faith in Christ. And if you can bring one of those hard-nosed skeptics to faith in Christ, they're going to bring a lot of people with them.
And for a lay reader, what would you like them to take from this book? Maybe someone who doesn't have a scientific background. It's more of your average person who's interested in Noah's flood. They've heard about it when they were a kid, and they're kind of surprised to see, oh, there's a book by a scientist where he's dissecting this and talking about it and believing it's actually true. What would you say to them of like what should they look for in your book?
Well, this is my 23rd book that I've written. This one took 5 years to write. And we had it peer reviewed by theologians and scientists because we wanted the book to be able to communicate at the highest academic levels. But we had a team of 6 editors that went through the book and said, hey, we want this to communicate to people who are not theologians, who are not scientists, people that have a high school education. And then I had to go through all their editorial comments where they tried to simplify things and say, wait a minute, you simplified it to such a degree, the science is no longer correct, the theology isn't correct. So we went back and forth. But I'm really happy that the book we have now is still able to communicate at the highest academic levels while being understandable to people with only a high school education.
I think you did it. I think you did it, and I found that to be true at Creator in the Cosmos as well. You really, you and your team have a knack for covering both bases there, and we super appreciate that.
Well, thank you. I'll pass it on to our team because one of the complaints we get is, why does it take you guys so long at Reasonably to bring a book out? But that's the reason why. We're
Hmm.
trying to ensure that it communicates to both audiences.
All right. Well, we've probably run over time at this point, but hope we didn't hold you off to anything that else you're doing, Dr. Ross.
No, I'm good. I got a meeting in 10 minutes, but I'm fine. So,
All right, good deal. Well, let's wrap this up then. Really appreciate you coming on, just Dr. Ross. We're kind of a smaller ministry right at this point, but we'd like to see it grow, get our chance to let people know that Jesus is real. He did rise from the dead. When you read the Bible, you can understand that it is historical. We didn't even get into the historicity of the Bible, but those things are, at least they did impact for me, that if God's telling me a story, he's telling it from the start to the finish, and he's giving me real facts, things that I can count on, things that will be looked up over time, like we've recently found out where Mount Sinai really is, at least that's what it seems. And those type of things really, really help my faith. So I'm just happy that you're down that road, and the fact that you're evangelist, and just want to pray for that fact, that we do get a chance to share God's love with folks. And maybe they have a question that we have an answer for them, because right now there's a bunch of questions, as I'm sure you run into as much as we do, maybe more. So,
well, I've been posting a lot on my Facebook and X pages, and I can tell you, I've probably fielded now 600 different questions on the flood. So yeah, it does generate a lot of questions. I love the fact that you guys are evangelists. So keep it up, and you ask me great questions. I don't
yeah,
get that all the time. You guys did a good job.
thank you.
Thank you so
All
much,
right,
Dr.
thank you,
Ross.
Ross. Thank you.